You're walking through the marble corridors of the imperial palace in Rome, 39 AD. The air is thick with incense and fear. In the distance, you hear the sound of laughter, but it's wrong somehow. Too high, too long, echoing off the walls, like the cry of a wounded animal. That laughter belongs to Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, and it's the sound that haunts the nightmares of everyone who serves in this palace. But before we dive into one of history's most disturbing stories of power and obsession, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Today we're exploring a tale that most history books gloss over. The story of a young man named Marcus whose life was destroyed to feed an emperor's madness. And please, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I'm always amazed that we can connect across time and continents to explore these dark chapters of human history together. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Roman excess. It's the story of how trauma creates monsters, how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how one young man's quiet dignity became the only light in an empire consumed by darkness. Let's begin with the boy who would become the center of this nightmare. Marcus Flavius was born around 20 AD in the hills outside Rome, the son of a minor provincial administrator. His family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't destitute either, that dangerous middle ground that could elevate you to greatness or destroy you without warning. Marcus showed early promise as a scholar. Ancient sources describe him as unusually intelligent, with a gift for languages and mathematics that caught the attention of his tutors. He learned Greek fluently, could recite Homer from memory, and possessed the kind of quick wit that made him popular among his peers. More importantly, he had what Romans called gravitas, a quiet dignity and self-possession rare in someone so young. When Marcus was 14, his father made a decision that would seal his son's fate. Hoping to advance the family's fortunes, he sent Marcus to serve in the imperial household, a common practice that could lead to wealth and influence, but also exposed young men to the whims of absolute power. Marcus entered palace service during the reign of Tiberius, when the imperial court was already a nest of paranoia and cruelty. But he adapted with the intelligence that had always marked him. He learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between favor and execution. He studied the faces of courtiers, memorized their alliances, and developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Most importantly, Marcus learned to make himself useful without making himself threatening. He became known for his discretion, his ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced, and his talent for remaining nearly invisible when powerful men were making decisions that could reshape the empire. But while Marcus was learning to survive in the imperial court, another young man was experiencing a very different kind of education in trauma and power. Gaius Caligula wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early life seemed blessed by the gods themselves. Born into the most powerful family in Rome, son of the beloved general Germanicus, he spent his early childhood among soldiers who adored him. They gave him his nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, because he wore miniature military gear around the camps. But that golden childhood ended abruptly when Caligula was just 7 years old. His father Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances. Many suspected poison ordered by Emperor Tiberius, who feared Germanicus's popularity. Almost overnight, Caligula's world transformed from love and security to suspicion and fear. What followed was a masterclass in psychological destruction. Tiberius, perhaps feeling guilty about Germanicus's death, took Caligula under his wing. But Tiberius was himself a deeply damaged man, paranoid and cruel, who ruled through fear and manipulation. For nearly a decade, Caligula lived on the island of Capri, watching the emperor's increasingly erratic behavior. Ancient historians tell us that Tiberius used young Caligula as a psychological experiment, alternately praising and humiliating him, testing his reactions to violence and cruelty. The boy learned that survival meant pleasing a madman, and that Love could be withdrawn as quickly as it was given. By the time Caligula emerged from Capri to inherit the throne at age 24, something fundamental had broken inside him. The charming child who had delighted Roman soldiers had become something else entirely, a man who understood power only as a tool for inflicting the same psychological torment he had endured. Initially, Rome celebrated his accession. After years of Tiberius's paranoid rule, Caligula seemed like a return to the glory days of Augustus. He freed political prisoners, gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and staged spectacular games that delighted the people. But those early signs of generosity masked something much darker. Caligula's kindness was performative, designed to win loyalty that he could later exploit. And beneath the surface, careful observers like Marcus began to notice troubling patterns. Marcus, now in his late teens and established as a trusted palace administrator, had a unique vantage point to observe the new emperor. Where others saw generosity, Marcus noticed the calculating coldness in Caligula's eyes. Where others heard witty remarks, Marcus detected the cruel edge that suggested these weren't jokes but threats. It was during these early months of Caligula's reign that Marcus first encountered the woman who would become the instrument of both their destructions. Drusilla wasn't just Caligula's favorite sister, she was the only person in the world he seemed capable of loving without reservation. The relationship between Caligula and Drusilla shocked even jaded Roman aristocrats. While incest wasn't unknown among the imperial family, their bond went far beyond political convenience. Ancient sources describe an obsession so complete that Caligula would fly into rages if Drusilla so much as spoke to other men. Marcus watched this relationship with the careful attention he brought to all palace dynamics. He saw how Drusilla was the one person who could calm Caligula's increasingly violent moods, how her presence seemed to anchor whatever remained of his sanity. He also saw how fragile that anchor was becoming. By 38 AD, Caligula's behavior had become increasingly erratic. He declared himself a living god, demanded worship from Roman citizens, and began executing people for imagined slights. The palace became a place of constant terror, where a misplaced word or gesture could mean death. Marcus survived by becoming even more invisible, more useful, more perfectly attuned to the emperor's moods. He developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Caligula's needs, appearing with wine before the emperor realized he was thirsty, clearing rooms before fits of rage erupted. But in the summer of 38 AD, the unthinkable happened. Drusilla fell ill with a fever that ravaged the city. Despite having access to the best physicians in the empire, despite Caligula's frantic prayers to every god he could name, despite his desperate threats against anyone who couldn't cure her, Drusilla died. The sound that emerged from Caligula when he realized Drusilla was gone wasn't quite human. Marcus, standing in the antechamber, later described it as the howl of something that had never learned how to grieve properly. It was the sound of a mind finally snapping under pressure it had carried since childhood. What followed was weeks of behavior so bizarre that even Caligula's supporters began to question his sanity. He refused to allow Drusilla's body to be buried, instead keeping it in his private chambers and talking to it as if she were still alive. He declared her a goddess, established temples in her honor, and made it a capital crime to suggest she was actually dead. Marcus found himself assigned to help maintain the grotesque charade. Every day, he had to help prepare meals for a corpse, arrange fresh flowers around a decomposing body, and pretend not to notice the smell of death that permeated the emperor's quarters. It was during these horrifying weeks that Marcus first noticed Caligula staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. At first, he assumed it was just the emperor's general madness. But gradually, he realized there was something specific about the attention, something that made him want to find reasons to avoid Caligula's presence. The truth became clear one morning when Caligula cornered Marcus in the corridor outside Drusilla's chambers. "You have her eyes," the emperor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The same shape, the same color. Even the way you look down. When you're thinking." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. He had always known he was attractive. That was part of how he'd survived in the palace, using his appearance to gain favor without threatening anyone. But he had never considered that his features might resemble those of the dead empress. "You will come to my chambers tonight," Caligula continued, still staring with that unnerving intensity. "We have things to discuss." Marcus knew that refusing wasn't an option. That evening, he presented himself at the emperor's door with the same careful composure he brought to every palace encounter. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found inside. Caligula had arranged the room like a shrine to Drusilla. Her dresses were laid out on the bed, her jewelry scattered across tables, her perfumes filling the air with sickly sweetness. And in the center of it all sat the emperor, still talking to his sister's corpse as if she could respond. "She's been waiting for you," Caligula said without turning around. "She told me you would come. She told me you would help us." That night, Marcus learned the full extent of Caligula's plan. The emperor had convinced himself that the gods had sent Marcus to serve as a vessel for Drusilla's spirit. With the right preparations, the right rituals, the right physical modifications, Marcus could become the perfect host for his beloved sister's return. The next months were a systematic destruction of everything Marcus had been. First came the clothes Drusilla's dresses altered to fit his frame. Then the jewelry, the perfumes, the cosmetics. Caligula hired the best artists in Rome to teach Marcus feminine mannerisms, speech patterns, even the way Drusilla had held her hands when she spoke. But Marcus's intelligence, the same gift that had helped him survive so long in the palace, became his salvation. He realized that his only chance of survival lay in becoming the perfect performance of what Caligula wanted. So he studied Drusilla's mannerisms with the same careful attention he had once given to court politics. He learned to mimic her laugh, her way of tilting her head when listening, even her preferred topics of conversation. But privately, in the deepest parts of his mind, he built walls to protect whatever remained of his original self. Marcus developed elaborate mental exercises to maintain his sanity. He would recite Homer's epic silently while applying makeup, using the familiar rhythm to anchor himself to his real identity. He memorized mathematical problems and solved them during dress fittings, keeping his intellect sharp even as his appearance was systematically feminized. Most importantly, Marcus began to understand Caligula in a way that perhaps no one else ever had. He saw that the emperor's madness wasn't random, it was the logical result of a childhood spent learning that love and cruelty were inseparable, that power was the only protection against abandonment. This understanding became Marcus's weapon. He learned to manage Caligula's moods not through fear, but through careful psychological manipulation. When the emperor grew violent, Marcus would speak in Drusilla's voice about memories only she would have known. When Caligula became paranoid, Marcus would offer the kind of comfort that only a beloved sister could provide. The physical transformations came gradually. Caligula consulted physicians about procedures that could make Marcus appear more feminine. But Marcus managed to delay these through careful suggestions that Drusilla's spirit needed time to settle into her new form. For over a year, Marcus walked this impossible tightrope, maintaining the performance that kept him alive while protecting the core of his identity from complete destruction. He became perhaps the most psychologically resilient person in Rome, developing coping mechanisms that would have impressed modern trauma specialists. But in 40 AD, Caligula's obsession with making the transformation permanent finally overcame Marcus's delaying tactics. The emperor announced his intention to marry Drusilla in a grand ceremony that would prove to Rome that the gods had blessed his rule with a miracle. The wedding preparations took months and consumed enormous resources. Marcus was moved to special quarters designed to replicate Drusilla's former rooms in exact detail. Every day brought new lessons in being someone else: voice coaches, dance instructors, even specialists who taught him to eat and drink in appropriately feminine ways. But perhaps most psychologically devastating were the private moments when Caligula would forget that Marcus wasn't really Drusilla. The emperor would reference shared childhood memories, ask about people Marcus had never met, even become angry when Drusilla couldn't remember events from before her return. These moments required Marcus to improvise constantly, creating plausible responses based on his years of observing palace life. It was like being forced to perform in a play where the script changed without warning, and a single wrong line could mean death. The wedding itself was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury. Caligula spared no expense, importing flowers from Egypt, musicians from Greece, and delicacies from across the empire. To outside observers who didn't know the full story, it might have looked like the marriage of the century. But those who understood the true situation witnessed something unprecedented in Roman history: the most powerful man in the world publicly marrying a surgically and psychologically modified young man dressed as his dead sister. Following the ceremony, Marcus was forced to live as Caligula's empress in every sense. He received his own household staff, participated in state functions, and was expected to provide the kind of companionship that only Drusilla had ever given the emperor. This period, lasting nearly a year, represented perhaps the most psychologically complex challenge in Marcus's young life. By day, he had to be the perfect imperial wife, offering advice on policy, hosting social functions, and maintaining the elaborate fiction for Rome's elite. By night, he had to provide emotional support to a man whose madness was growing worse by the day. Marcus survived by developing what we might now recognize as dissociative techniques. He learned to separate his conscious mind from the role he was performing, watching himself play Drusilla as if from outside his own body. This psychological distance allowed him to maintain his sanity while becoming increasingly skilled at anticipating Caligula's needs. But by 41 AD, even Marcus's extraordinary resilience was reaching its limits. Caligula's behavior had become so erratic that rumors of conspiracy began circulating among the Praetorian Guard. The emperor's paranoia reached new heights, and he began suspecting even Drusilla of disloyalty. The end came suddenly, as these things often do in imperial Rome. On January 24, 41 AD, members of the Praetorian Guard cornered Caligula in an underground passage and stabbed him to death. The assassination was swift and brutal, ending 4 years of increasingly insane rule. But Caligula's death left Marcus in an incredibly precarious position. He was simultaneously the most visible symbol of the dead emperor's reign and a witness to secrets that could embarrass or implicate powerful people. The new emperor, Claudius, faced a delicate political problem: what to do with the young man everyone knew as Drusilla. What happened to Marcus after Caligula's death remains one of history's mysteries. Official records show that Empress Drusilla simply disappears from all documentation after January 41 AD. Some historians suggest he was quietly executed to eliminate an embarrassing reminder of Caligula's excesses. But other sources hint at a different possibility. There are fragmentary references to a young man matching Marcus's description, who appeared in Alexandria around 42 AD, working as a tutor and scholar. These accounts describe someone who seemed unusually knowledgeable about palace life, but who lived quietly, avoiding attention and using a name that wasn't quite Roman and wasn't quite Greek. There's something almost mythical about this possibility, the idea that someone who had been so completely stripped of identity could rebuild himself from nothing. If Marcus did escape to Alexandria, he would have had to learn how to be himself again after years of being someone else. The psychological journey from imperial prisoner to free man would have been perhaps more challenging than his original ordeal. After years of constant performance, how do you rediscover your authentic self? How do you trust your own thoughts and desires when you've spent so long suppressing them? But Marcus had always been remarkable for his intelligence and adaptability. If anyone could have made such a transition, it would have been someone who had survived 4 years as Caligula's empress, while maintaining his sanity and core identity. The last possible reference to Marcus appears in a letter from a Roman merchant visiting Alexandria in 48 AD. He describes meeting a tutor who seemed familiar, someone who spoke with unusual authority about Roman politics but who immediately changed the subject when pressed for details. He had the most remarkable eyes, the merchant wrote, the kind that seemed to have seen too much but had somehow found peace despite it all. When he smiled, it was like watching someone remember how to be genuinely happy. Whether this mysterious tutor was actually Marcus, we'll never know for certain. But the description captures something important about the kind of person who could have survived what he endured, someone whose fundamental humanity remained intact despite everything that was done to destroy it. Marcus's story reminds us that behind every narrative of imperial power and political intrigue, there are individual human stories of survival and resilience that deserve our attention. His tale isn't just about the corruption of absolute power, it's about the extraordinary strength of the human spirit when faced with systematic dehumanization, and choosing to survive, to adapt, and perhaps ultimately to escape. Marcus demonstrated a kind of courage that's often overlooked in historical accounts. He may not have led armies or written great works of literature, but he preserved something precious, his essential humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it completely. Today, when we think about trauma and resilience, about identity and survival, Marcus's story offers both a warning and an inspiration. It shows us how easily human dignity can be stripped away by those with power, but also how that dignity can be secretly preserved and ultimately reclaimed by those with sufficient inner strength. The boy who became an empress, who survived 4 years as the plaything of a mad emperor, who may have found freedom in the shadow of Alexandria's great library, his story deserves to be remembered not just as a curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to the indestructible core of human resilience that survives even our darkest chapters. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more hidden stories from history. And let me know in the comments, what other forgotten figures from the ancient world would you like to see explored? There are so many untold stories waiting to be discovered, so many voices that deserve to be heard across the centuries.